Hello, and welcome to our virtual roundtable at the annual meeting of the ASA. My name is Michelle Eilers, and I'm the presider for our roundtable on sexual behaviors. I would like to thank our presenters for sharing their research and presenting it for us in this virtual format. Thank you also for participating virtually as an audience member. Please feel free to reach out to presenters with feedback and questions. Their contact information is listed with their presentation. Today, we'll hear about 3 papers on the topic of sexual relationships. I will introduce each presentation along with the presenter's information. The first presentation is by me, Michelle Eilers, on moral attitudes and sexual behavior. Is there a dynamic relationship? Next, we'll hear from Dr. Lele, explaining the decline in young adult sexual behavior in the United States. And finally, we'll hear from Megan Steele on family context and adolescent risky sexual behavior, an examination of the influence of family structure, family transitions, and parenting. We'll now hear the presentation on moral attitudes and sexual behavior. Is there a dynamic relationship? Given by me, Michelle Eilers, graduate student in sociology and demography at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, so I'm going to get started with the presentation. Young women's moral beliefs and behaviors are socially determined through messaging from the social environment. First, family norms and behaviors provide the primary source of influence over young women's attitudes and behaviors, especially during childhood and adolescence. Beyond this, school environments shape norms around sexual behavior through observing classmate norms and behaviors, and also through sex education curriculum. Additionally, we know from assortative mating literature and homophily literature that individuals tend to select friends and romantic partners who share their own beliefs, and those people may in turn influence young women's attitudes about sex and their sexual behavior. Finally, religious organizations, particularly within Christianity in the United States, draw on narratives that sex is to occur only within the context of marriage. Moreover, this period in the life course is particularly important as young women graduate high school and continue to college or enter the workforce, potentially leaving the parental nest and childhood sources of influence, and also meeting new people who may have differing opinions about sex. Specifically in the United States, sexual activity is common during the transition to adulthood. Just under half of American teens have had sex by age 18, and 95% of young people have had premarital sex by age 24. Moreover, unintended pregnancy remains common, accounting for just under half of all pregnancies across all age groups, and this number is closer to 70% of pregnancies to teenagers. Beyond this, sexuality is framed as either a moral issue that sex should occur within marriage, or a risk issue that sex among young and unmarried people is always dangerous. And this messaging is espoused in 37 states in the United States that requires some form of abstinence emphasis in their sex education curriculum. Taken together, this suggests that young people may feel that premarital sex is wrong and may not be prepared to have sex safely should they decide to have sex. We know from research using the GSS that over the course of several decades, premarital sex has become increasingly acceptable among adults in the United States. However, recent findings suggest that the bulk of social norms and attitudes reported by US adults tend to remain consistent over time. Moreover, sex is an especially salient issue for young people, especially around the time of their sexual debut, and this has the propensity to affect their attitudes. Additional research has found that religiosity is one of the most important predictors of one's sexual attitudes. Beyond this, much of our attitudinal data rely on long time lapses before individuals update their attitudes for researchers. This then leaves open questions about the temporal nature of sexual attitudes and behavior, especially in the short term. Do attitudes precede behavior? And do they influence behavior? Do they persist if one engages in the behavior? This study seeks to address these questions. Given my interest in how moral attitudes about premarital sex interact with young women's sexual behaviors, I ask the following questions. First, how does moral opposition to premarital sex evolve in the transition to adulthood? Next, is there a reciprocal relationship between sexual moral attitudes and sexual behavior? And finally, how do these patterns vary for women who become sexually active during the transition to adulthood? To answer these questions, I draw on rich longitudinal data from the Relationship Dynamics in Social Life study, which surveyed 1,003 women ages 18 to 22 from Genesee County, Michigan between 2008 and 2012. And just to contextualize, Genesee County is where Flint and surrounding areas are located. Women were sampled using simple random sampling of ID holders and were interviewed in person at baseline and then completed an online survey each week for 2.5 years. For this analysis, I draw on a sample of just over 2,000 survey quarters, and each quarter is about 12 weeks of information. This comes from 519 women who are 18 or 19 at baseline, not married or pregnant. For each woman, this corresponds to about 4 quarters of data or just under a year of information. To answer these questions, I simultaneously predict whether a woman had sex in a given 12-week period, which I refer to as a quarter, as well as her moral opposition to premarital sex in that time frame. The question used to capture moral attitudes is, do you think the premarital sex is wrong? And is measured on a 0 to 4 scale, with higher values indicating increasing opposition to premarital sex. In these models, I control for the following social environment predictors about the woman, measured at baseline: her race, religiosity, childhood household family structure, and age at sexual debut. Religiosity is one of the strongest predictors of sexual moral attitudes, and so I control for it in all models to better isolate the effects of moral attitudes above and beyond religiosity. Additional time-varying measures about the respondent include her current educational level, number of live births, and relationship status. I also draw on her mother's characteristics, which include her mother's education level and whether her mother's first birth occurred as a teenager. And I finally include additional friend and family characteristics, including parents' and friends' approval of the respondent having sex, as well as how many of the respondent's friends are sexually active. To answer these questions, I first describe moral opposition to premarital sex over time using locally weighted kernel estimation plots. I also describe moral opposition before and after sexual debut, as well as the occurrence of sexual intercourse throughout the study using frequencies. And I then fit cross-lagged panel models to understand first whether moral opposition to sex predicts sexual intercourse in the next time period, and second, whether having sexual intercourse predicts subsequent moral opposition. This particular model allows me to assess these relationships simultaneously, which I will describe in more detail in the next slide. I then repeat these models among the subsample of young women who have not yet been sexually active at baseline. As I previously stated, cross-lagged models enable me to assess the reciprocal relationship between attitudes and behaviors. In this case, whether opposition to premarital sex affects the likelihood of having sex, and whether having sex affects attitudinal opposition to sex. This is accomplished using repeated measures of attitudes and behaviors. After controlling for stability in attitudes over time, as well as stability in sex over time, as well as the correlation between attitudes and sex within a given time period, I am able to isolate the cross-lagged effects of attitudes at time t-1 on the risk of sexual intercourse at time t, and also estimate the effects of sexual intercourse at time t-1 on sexual attitudes at time t. So in these models, I assess if attitudes at time 2, which is in the middle at the top, affect sex at time 3, in the bottom right quarter, and whether sex at time 2, middle bottom, affects attitudes at time 3, top right. In the interest of time, I am showing descriptive results of moral opposition in sexual intercourse, and feel free to follow up with me to see additional sample description. This graph shows the mean value of moral opposition to premarital sex over time by sexual debut status. On the left, women who have not yet had sex report an opposition of around 3 on a 0 to 4 scale at baseline, which falls to about 2.5 by the 4th quarter or after about a year. For already active women, sexually active women, on the right, their moral opposition starts a whole point lower, falling from 2 at baseline to just over 1.5 after a year. For young women who sexually debut during the study, this graph shows their moral opposition preceding and following sexual debut. From left to right, the bar on the far left corresponds to 6 months prior to debut, 3 months, time of debut, and 3 and 6 months after debut, and suggests that moral opposition is stable around 2.5 on that 0 to 4 scale until sexual debut, and then falls to 2 following debut. This table shows the percentage of women who report any sex in a given 12-week period. On the top row, among all teenage women, roughly 56% report sex, having any sex in a given quarter. Among virgins at baseline, just over 10% report sex in the initial quarters, and this rises to about a quarter of women who are sexually active by the 4th quarter, Q4. Now let's look at the results for the cross-lagged panel models. The top panel is of all young women. The first row indicates that moral opposition to premarital sex at time 3 and 4 is negatively associated with intercourse at times 4 and 5. So these are the numbers negative 0.1 and negative 0.09. The line below shows that at each time point, having sex is associated with a small drop in opposition to premarital sex in the following quarter. Focusing on just women who have never had sex at baseline, the bottom panel indicates very little effect of moral opposition on the likelihood of sexual intercourse at the next quarter. While the coefficient at quarter 4 is significant, this represents a 5% lower chance of having sex for each increase in opposition to sex. Yet in the line below, for young women who have sex in a given quarter, their moral opposition falls by almost an entire point in the next quarter. To summarize, moral opposition to premarital sex is common among teenage women, especially among virgins at baseline. Opposition to premarital sex has a small effect on sexual behavior among already sexually active teenagers and among women who have never had sex. And having sex reduces moral opposition to premarital sex, especially around sexual debut. These findings confirm a temporal nature between sexual attitudes and behavior, especially around the time of sexual debut. Young women are engaging in premarital sex despite feeling opposed to premarital sex, which raises questions around women's experiences having sex, as well as their preparedness for intercourse. For example, as young women become sexually active, they may need additional support to prepare them to engage in healthy sexual behaviors through discussion about healthy ways of giving consent. It also suggests that if young women are opposed to having sex, yet engage in sexual intercourse, they may not have acquired contraceptive methods to protect against pregnancy and STI transmission. This study may also be subject to limitations, including women's selection into sexual behavior, because the sample is limited to women ages 18 and 19, when over half of women have already become sexually active. However, women who debut later may be more socially conservative and have stronger moral opposition. And if their opposition declines following sex, my estimates of this effect are likely to be conservative. Overall, this study finds that while moral opposition to premarital sex is common for young women, they push through or ignore these attitudes and engage in sex anyway. And we should help prepare them for this reality so that they can engage in healthy sexual relationships. Thank you. We'll now hear the presentation explaining the decline in young adult sexual behavior in the United States, given by Dr. Lei Lei, Assistant Professor of Sociology at Rutgers University.
In this video, I would like to talk about our paper titled Explaining the Decline in Young Adult Sexual Activity in the United States. I'm Lei Lei from Rutgers University, and my co-author is Scott South from SUNY Albany. So first, let me talk about the background. So the frequency in which young adults have sexual intercourse has declined over recent decades in the US and in some other developed countries. For instance, the study by Twenge reported that the percentage of sexual inactive young adults have increased from 11% to 15% in recent decades. So the source of this decline have received little empirical attention, as explanations have fallen largely in the realm of scholarly or journalistic speculation. So we have little understanding of why young adults are having sexual intercourse less often than in the past. In this study, we will use longitudinal data to identify some possible reasons for the decline in the proportion of young adults who engage in sexual intercourse. we use the emerging adulthood theory as our theoretical framework. So the life course stage of young adulthood is characterized by financial insecurity, unstable employment, accumulation of student loan debts, rising age of marriage, delayed home living, self-focused leisure, and personal exploration. In this study, we will explore the following potential explanations for the decline in sexual activity. First is economic insecurity. So young adults' financial well-being has been more precarious in recent years than before. So this could make them less valued as romantic and sexual partners, leading to a decline in sexual activity. The formation of romantic relations or romantic unions is another driver for this trend. Marriage rates has been declining in recent years, although cohabitation rates has been remaining stable. And the decline in marriage and cohabitation has been shown to explain some, but not all of the decline in sexual relationship. However, no study has assessed the role of dating relationship or romantic relationship. The third factor is coexistence with parents. So in recent years, young adults have been increasingly living with parents, and the coexistence with parents leaves them less opportunities to engage in sexual behavior. And another factor we will consider is electronic media. So the advances in entertainment technology have provided alternative pleasure to sexual intercourse for young adults. So this could partly explain why sexual intercourse has been declining among young adults. So it also leaves them less opportunity to socialize with other young adults and to develop romantic relationships. So we also consider two other factors, which are the psychological distress and alcohol use. So recent studies have shown increasing trend of psychological distress among young adults and decreasing frequency of alcohol use. So these two trends could contribute to the decline in sexual activity. So we use data from the panel study of income dynamics, transition to adulthood supplement in our research. We will limit the data between the years of 2007 to 2017, and we restrict the age to age 18 to 23 in order to obtain similar age distributions across the years. Data in 2011 were dropped because of processing errors by the PSID staff. And the final analytical sample includes 3,213 respondents who contribute to 5,671 person-year observations. The dependent variable for this study is a dichotomous measure of whether the respondents reports having had sex during the 4 weeks preceding each interview. The independent variable is year, which is a survey year coded as a continuous variable. The mediators or the potential explanations for this trend in sexual activity includes the employment status and earning from work in the previous year, and the categorical variable for marital and cohabitation status, as well as romantic relationship. We also measure whether they lived with parents in the previous year, and we include measures of frequency of using electronic medias for purpose of such as schooling, email, online shopping, etc. And we measure frequencies of playing computer games, TV watching, and the level of psychological distress and the frequency of alcohol consumption. At the same time, we control for a wide variety of individual and family characteristics in our analysis. So we use logistic regression models to predict the likelihood of sexual intercourse in the past months. And in subsequent models, the measures of potential explanations were added one at a time. And we also use the KHB method as a formal way to test the mediation effect. So this slide shows some descriptive statistics comparing the rates of sexual intercourse and the measures of the mediators between the first and the last year of our observation. So as you can see, in 2007, almost 60% of young adults had sexual intercourse in the past months, but this has dropped to 49% in 2017. Right? And for employment, over time, more young adults become employed, but for earnings, it has declined over time. And looking at the relationship status over time, higher percentage of young adults were not in any relationship. And for correspondence with parents, over time, a higher percentage of young adults lived with parents. And the frequency of playing computer games and internet use have both increased over time, but TV watching has been declined over time. Psychological distress barely changed over time, and the frequency of drinking has declined over time. So most of these trends are consistent with our expectations. Then I would like to show the logistic regression models predicting the likelihood of engaging in sexual intercourse. So the model 1 here is our baseline model showing the time trend. So a negative coefficient for the year of observation means that the likelihood of sexual intercourse has declined over time between 2007 and 2017. In model 2, we include employment and earnings as our explaining variables. So earnings has a curvilinear relationship with sexual activity, and including these predictors have explained 17% of the decline in sexual activity according to the formal mediation test. In model 3, we include the romantic relationship and marriage and cohabitation status. So compared to young adults who are not in a relationship, being in a romantic relationship or being married or cohabiting are related with higher likelihood of sexual behavior, and the romantic relationship explains 34% of the decline in sexual activity. In model 4, we assess the role of co-residence with parents. So living with parents leads to lower rates of sexual activity, and this explains almost 10% of the decline in sexual activity. In model 5, we include computer game playing. So playing computer game leads to lower rates of sexual activity, and it explains 22.5% of the overall trend. In model 6, we assess the role of internet use and television watching. They are marginally significant, but they did not contribute to any of the declining trend of sexual activity. So actually, these two variables tend to suppress the effect of year, right? So in model 7, we examine the role of psychological distress, which does not have a significant impact. So it also explains only 0% of the trend in sexual activity. And finally, we looked at drinking behaviors. So drinking is positively related to sexual activity, but the declining trend in drinking behavior explained almost 27% of the decline in sexual activity. Right? So when we include all the mediating variables, 75% of the decline in sexual activity has been explained. So now let's move to discussion and conclusion. So the decline in sexual activity is a salutary trend because it leads to a lower rates of STD and also lower unplanned pregnancy. Some other researchers says it is detrimental because it it signals a reduction in potentially intimate relationship and physical pleasure. So regardless of the values assigned to this trend, it is important to understand the reason for the decline. So through this research, we find that the decline in the formation of romantic relationships and the reduction in alcohol consumption played the most important role in this decline in sexual behavior. Also, declining earnings and increasing frequency of playing computer games also played a significant role. So there's no evidence has been found that internet use or psychological distress are the mechanisms for the decline in sexual behavior.
Our last presentation is Family Context and Adolescent Risky Sexual Behavior, an examination of the influence of family structure, family transitions, and parenting, given by Megan Steele, doctoral candidate in sociology at the University of Georgia.
So good afternoon, my name is Megan Steele. I am a doctoral candidate in the Department of Sociology at University of Georgia, and today I'll be presenting a paper entitled Family Context and Adolescent Risky Sexual Behavior, an examination of the influence of family structure, family transitions, and parenting. This paper was recently accepted for publication in the Journal of Youth and Adolescence and was written with co-authors Leslie Simmons, Tara Sutton, and Frederick Gibbons. So to begin, what is risky sexual behavior? Risky sex includes behaviors such as early sexual debut, high rates of partner change, and inconsistent condom use. And these behaviors are of significant concern to parents, policymakers, and researchers. This is because they put youth at risk for a variety of adverse health and social outcomes, including sexually transmitted infections, unintended pregnancy, lower educational attainment, and increased poverty. Much of the literature on adolescent risky sexual behavior has focused on the significance of adolescents' family context. Specifically, families have been shown to impact adolescent risky sex through their composition or structure, their stability or instability, through their approach to parenting, and by their influence on adolescents' sexual attitudes and affiliation with sexually active peers. So, although significant progress has been made to understanding how adolescents' family context might shape the risky sexual behavior, there's really been a dearth of research on African American adolescents and their families. In particular, most studies have looked at white samples, or when they had other races included in their sample, included race as a control or interaction effect. There also has been incomplete assessments of risky sexual behavior. So while the CDC defines risky sex as having three components, number of sexual partners, age at sexual debut, and consistency of condom use, most studies examine only age at sexual debut or number of sexual partners. There also has been an examination of only a limited array of family structures and transitions. In particular, research has overlooked one common configuration in African American families, families that are parented by a mother and a biological relative, such as a grandmother and aunt. Also, most studies focusing on transitions examine exclusively mothers' divorces, or when they include mothers cohabiting breakups, combine them into an aggregate measure. However, we believe it's possible that mothers' divorces and cohabiting separations have differing effects on adolescent sexual debut. There's also been a lack of attention to the mediating processes that can link family structure and transitions to adolescents' risky sex, such as parenting and adolescent sexual attitudes and affiliation with sexually active peers. So to address these gaps in the literature, we focused on African American families who participated in 3 waves of the Family and Community Health Study, or FACS. And we examined the relationship between family structure, family transitions, parenting, adolescent sexual attitudes, and affiliation with sexually active peers. Specifically, we're interested in whether parenting and adolescent sexual attitudes and affiliation with sexually active peers might mediate the relationship between certain family structures, family transitions, and adolescents' risky sex. We also use more inclusive assessments of family structure and transitions than utilized in previous research, which I'll talk about a little bit further when we get to the measures. So the sample for the current study, as I mentioned previously, is FACS, or the Family and Community Health Study, which is a multi-site investigation of the neighborhood and family effects on the health and development of African Americans, and it includes families from a wide range of community contexts. It's a non-probability sample of 889 African American children and their primary caregivers who were recruited in 1997 from communities in both Georgia and Iowa. If a second parent or caregiver was living in the home at the time of recruitment, they were also invited to participate. We utilized data from waves 2, 3, and 4 when the target adolescent was between the ages of 12 and 18. The sample for the current study was limited to families where a mother was the primary caregiver and co-caregivers were a biological father, stepfather, romantic cohabiting partner, or biological relative, or in cases where no co-caregiver or secondary caregiver was identified, a single mother. So with these limitations, the final sample for this study consisted of 304 female and 246 male youth who were present at all 3 waves of data. So next, I'm going to provide just a brief overview of the measures used in the current study. Risky sexual behavior was measured using all 3 behaviors: age at sexual debut, lifetime number of sexual partners, and frequency of condom use. All 3 of these variables were standardized and summed to form the measure. Next, family structure included married mother-father, mother-stepfather, a mother cohabiting partner, a mother relative, and a single mother. Family transitions included both mother's number of divorces and mother's number of cohabiting separations. Mother's parenting included nurture-involved parenting and hostility. We also measured co-caregivers parenting, which is also nurture-involved parenting and hostility. And to be more specific, nurture-involved parenting included 15 items that indicated measures of warmth, inductive reasoning, monitoring, resistant discipline. And then we also measured 2 adolescent factors, which were attitudes about sex or permissive sexual attitudes and sexually active peers. So the analytical strategy for the current study was to estimate a series of regression models using MPLUS version 8.1. And we estimated 9 different models, and the first 4 models are going to focus on differences in risky sex by family structure and family transitions, including single mother families, while testing the proposed mitigating effects of parenting, adolescent risky sexual attitudes, and peer affiliation. And then in the next set of models, we evaluated differences among only 2 caregiver families to allow for the inclusion of co-caregivers' parenting behaviors. As a formal test of mediation, we used bias-corrected bootstrapping in MPLUS using 1,000 draws and looked at the significance of the indirect effects within a 95% confidence interval. So I'll begin with the results for family structure and family transitions. So we find that female adolescents who reside in a single mother, mother-stepfather, or mother cohabiting household engage in greater risky sex, abbreviated here on out as RSB, than those who lived in married mother-father households. Males, on the other hand, who lived with a single mother, mother-stepfather, or a mother relative engage in more risky sex than those who lived in married mother-father households. We also saw that mothers' number of cohabiting separations were significant in predicting females' increased engagement in risky sexual behavior. However, in the first set of models, family transitions did not have an effect on males' risky sexual behavior. So looking at the parenting and adolescent factors that might mediate this relationship, we found that for females, effects from family structure and family transitions to the risky sexual behavior primarily occurred through variation in mother's hostility, greater affiliation with sexually active peers, and holding more permissive sexual attitudes. However, for males, effects from family structure to risky sex mainly occur through increases in mother's hostility and increased affiliation with sexually active peers. Nevertheless, there were few remaining significant effects that were not explained by either parenting or adolescent factors. Specifically, for females, the effects of having resided with a mother and cohabiting partner, a single mother, and mother's number of cohabiting separations continue to be significant, whereas for males, the impact of living in a mother-relative household on their risky sex also persisted. So turning to the results for 2 caregiver families so that we could see whether the inclusion of co-givers parenting might explain some of these lingering family structure and family transition effects, we found that the inclusion of co-givers parenting was influential only in explaining some of the family structure effects for males. Specifically, males in continuously married mother-father households reported that their fathers engaged in greater nurture-involved parenting than their stepfathers did. We also saw mother's number of divorces emerge as a significant predictor of males' risky sexual behavior. This implicates essentially that when mothers experience a divorce and it results in a new caregiver entering the household, this was particularly detrimental for males' risky sex. Nonetheless, the impact of having resided in a mother-cohabiting partner or mother-stepfather household for girls and the effect of having lived in a mother relative and mother's number of divorces for boys were not explained by differences in co-givers, nurture-involved, or hostile parenting. So in some, continuously married mother-father households were the most effective in reducing risky sex for both males and females. However, we also see that mother-relative households were beneficial for females compared to other household types. The frequency of transitions among caregivers was also important for both males and females, with mothers and divorces being particularly detrimental for males and mothers' number of coding breakups being particularly detrimental for females. Some of these effects were mediated by variation in parenting and adolescents' affiliation with sexually active peers. Nonetheless, even after we accounted for the impact of all of these mediators, family structure and transitions at age 13 continued to influence participation in risky sex when adolescents were 18 years of age. So in conclusion, our findings demonstrate support for an integrated model that combines family structure, family instability, and parenting. This counters earlier models that were specifically focused on the role of family structure or on the role of family instability alone. It didn't take into account how these might be overlapping and intertwining processes. And so it's also important to note that while using an all-African American sample allowed us to examine a high-risk yet understudied population, we need greater replication with more diverse samples, particularly other racial and ethnic groups. And this is due in part because we had a very interesting finding that mother-relative families were associated with a significant increase in antisocial or in risky sexual behavior for males, but this household type was favorable for females compared to other household types. This is suggesting that a closer examination of this family is essential when we're studying the effects of family structure for African American youth and perhaps for other racial and ethnic groups. So I know that was a very brief overview, and if you have any further questions, I would encourage you to go ahead and read our study available via the Journal of Youth and Adolescence, or reach out to me via email at megan.steele@uga.edu. And thank you so much for your time.